So I'm in the lab of Claudia Clopin, and in this project we were trying to understand how to connect plasticity, so weight changes in a network, to how you can change neural manifolds, and then effectively maybe explain this in the context of a learning behavior. So the big question basically is how weight changes between neurons modulate the neural activity, and this then miraculously lead to learning a new behavior, like for example, riding a bicycle. And appreciate that if you want to do experiments to probe all these three different things, it's basically impossible nowadays, because what you can do, you can measure the neural activity and observe the learning behavior, maybe, if you're lucky. But it's basically impossible, as far as I know, to do this tracking of connections between neurons in real time during learning of a task. So it's very unclear how you really bridge this gap. Although we know already a lot about like single cell, or like if two cells are paired, how they change the connectivity. But inside of this whole framework, it's still very unclear. And so now you might think, yeah, if I have a learning behavior like this, probably two neurons are not sufficient at all to describe this or be able to explain what's going on. So what we have instead is a network of neurons which we think of are relevant for our task. For example, here, learning a new motor behavior, we maybe look in motor cortex. So, and then, I don't need to tell much about how the activity we measure from such a group of neurons might look like, because we now saw this in a lot of talks that it has been observed that if you measure maybe 1,000 neurons, the neural activity, if you plot it as like a trajectory in this high-dimensional space, it's only visiting lower dimensional space. And this lower dimensional space I will call from now on like the neural manifold, just as a convention. Yeah, and so it has been proposed by Sarah Soller and colleagues that this neural manifold is really important in the context of motor behavior, and for example also in motor adaptation. And the question we asked ourselves then was, like, how could the brain control then this neural manifold? Because in the end you don't have knobs somewhere where you have your latent variables and you change them. No, what you have the single neurons and you have the connection between them. So somehow you need to change this thing here in order to change the latent, like the manifold. But then you can also think of the other way around. Maybe the things we know about learning in such a network, maybe it's actually influenced by having such kind of dynamics in the system. So we were really interested in investigating, like in a computational model, like these two connections here, and actually in the context of a learning behavior. So our model actually has also some kind of output which we observe. So let me just briefly summarize some really cool experimental papers which inspired our work. Like, first of all, there's a paper you already heard of from Arvind, and I think also Sarah. It's this paper from Batista, Chase, and Yu collaboration, where they probed how able monkeys are to adapt their neural activity in motor cortex. And they had a really cool setup in a way that they could test if it's easier for the monkeys to adapt the neural activity in such a way that the new trajectory lies within this original manifold, or and if this is as easy as it would be to just learn a new neural activity trajectory which lies outside of this original manifold. And what they found is that the monkeys can do like the first within minutes, so really fast. And in comparison, this outside manifold learning was, like in this first paper, basically because they only looked at single sessions, they reported that it's not possible to do this at all. But then in a very recent paper from 2019, they actually showed that if you train the monkeys over days and with a very special training technique, you can observe some outside manifold learning. Yeah, and then there are these two papers here from Sarah Soller and Lee Miller's group, one of which I think you talked about, like that you that we observe one preserved manifold for different motor tasks in the monkey, and as well as this stable manifold across long time spans for one motor task. So all these results are very interesting, and we really wanted to understand what could potentially be the underlying neural mechanism which give rise to this, or at least what just identifying really players, because right now we really have no measurement in terms of neurocircuitry what is happening for these tasks. So that's why we are doing plasticity in our lab. So we started with the hypothesis that, okay, let's imagine in this case here of the learning, that the learning is really happening by changing weight connections inside the local network. So inside motor cortex in this example. And this is basically the hypothesis we started from, and then in our work we are going through several steps to see basically to which extent this assumption can account for the experimental observation. So we will focus on this first experiment here, and we actually will use the exact same setup as they did in the experiment. So let me just briefly, therefore, describe this again. So they used a very cool technique to probe these kind of questions. So they used a brain-computer interface. And the monkey, the basic task was a center outreach task. You also know what this is by now. So the monkey has to reach from the center to one of these targets. But instead, as normally maybe the monkey is using his hand, here the neural activity in motor cortex is directly read out and then decoded basically in 2D cursor velocities. So basically by this you circumvent the complexity of having the arm, because we also don't know exactly what the arm is doing. So here we have a direct mapping from this neural activity in motor cortex to the behavior, if you wish, because it's the cursor dynamics here. And the mapping was special because it had these two stages. So you start out with the neural activity you measure, which in their case was about 90 neurons or units. And then you do a dimensionality reduction on this. So this happens during a calibration session where you just measure the neural activity, and then you find, for example, they used factor analysis, and we are using PCA. Then you find this projection to the low-dimensional manifold. Then you have your latent space here, and then you train a decoder basically to successfully decode 2D cursor velocity from this 10-dimensional latent space. And the cool thing now is that you, after this initial training phase, where the monkey learns to use this BCI, or better, the BCI is also tuned to work with the monkey's activity, then you can perturb your mapping, which would then lead to, in order to be able to do the task good again, the monkey has to adapt its neural activity to work with this new mapping you impose on the monkey. And because they had these two steps here, they could really probe by, if they either scrambled here the mapping between the neural activity to the latent space, the monkey was enforced to go off of this original manifold, because you kind of, by this, impose a new plane in your state space, which is now the readout plane. And in order to work well with this decoder, again, the monkey has to shift its neural activity to this plane. Whereas if you scramble the mapping from the latent space to the kinematics, the monkey could still, like the neural activity could still be in this original manifold, but you have to change your trajectory inside of this manifold. So in our case, we don't have the monkey here, but instead what we have is a recurrent neural network. And we are basically using then all of the rest. So we have a similar BCI mapping, and also the task the network has to do is a center outreach task. But now we are really able to test our hypothesis in a way if the learning which we observe or which was observed in this experiment could be explained by really changing connections in this network here. And just to make clear, like as they also basically use firing rates instead of single spikes for this mapping, like we have here a rate network, just to mention this. Now, what does training mean in our case then? So the optimization process, in a sense, is that you want to minimize the task error. And the task error is computed by just calculating the difference between the optimal velocity vector, which is basically just a straight line from the center point to this target of the specific trial, and the produced cursor velocity, which you decoded with the BCI decoder from your neural activity in the network. And this error, and you want to minimize this error. So this is then two-dimensional. And what we use as a method to change the recurrent rates here, it's called recursive least square algorithm. And for this to work, we need an error on the activity of each single neuron in the network. So we kind of have to solve the credit assignment problem. We need to really say if for each neuron in the network, if the activity should go up or should go down in order to minimize the task error. And how do we do this? So we basically just do a linear transformation to get from this two-dimensional task error to the high-dimensional neural error. And this matrix here is in the optimal observer case, basically, given by the pseudo-inverse of this output transformation, because this then would, in fact, lead you to that the task error is really minimized. And just to note, this error, which I draw here, the error feedback, which is basically this matrix here, it's not a current. Like our network is, in a sense, really autonomous because the only input it gets is at the beginning of each trial, one short pulse signaling which of the 6 targets it should go to. So we have no constant or like ongoing input current to this network.
So these velocity vectors that you're comparing are at the beginning of the movement. You're asking whether the velocity vector that the network provides is pointing in the right direction.
It's not closed loop. So we compute this at every different time step, but I think what you're pointing at, it's not a closed loop. So it's always like this here, it's always fixed. So it's always pointing, if the center space is here and the target is here, it's always like this. Not if the network went here, it's now pointing like this. It's always pointing.
V target is fixed. It's
Yeah.
from the center to the target.
Exactly.
EV network is function of time, what the network is
It's-
producing
yeah,
as output.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So is the feedback error independent of network connection? Are feedback rates independent of the network connection?
Yeah.
Is that network recurrently connected network?
Yes.
And so whether this neuron should go up or down, shouldn't it depend on the downstream connection?
But this is the downstream connection, right? If I understand it correctly, like your decode, like you don't have an arm in this case, right? Your arm is your BCI. So the task error is directly, like you have the activity in the neural network, and you decode directly the cursor dynamics.
And all the neurons are observed.
Yeah.
How many of neurons are
In
observed?
our case, and what I will show you, we observed all neurons, which is not like this is another complication step when you think that
no hidden units.
no hidden units in the sense.
Sorry, can I ask? So why does the recurrence of the network not factor into the error? Like, why does the fact that if you modulate one neuron up and one neuron down, that will change, what the other neurons are saying, right?
You mean you're thinking of backprop through time or something like this?
Yeah. I see.
Because
Yeah.
like the recursively square is like a approximate method to this, in the sense that you don't have to do it's really at every single time step you get an error and then you change the weights and then you go to the next time step. You're not taking into account, which you normally do in backprop through time, that you propagate this back and then you, in the sense it's not optimal, but it has to show, it showed some, so like it's similar to what they did here. But in our case it's very distinct from what people previously have done with RNNs, because I think all of the papers I saw, they always also train the decoder. And we really focus the learning only on the recurrence here.
But so you're using force, but just on the weight matrix, on the J.
Yeah, if you call it that, I mean, then it's in the end only recursively square, because we don't have this rank 1 thing like force. We really train on the full recurrence, which is different. Okay, so that's our training, and then how do we, like our simulations we do, how do they look like? Like first we train our network to do the task, then we optimize this BCI mapping to also be able to do the task. Then we measure for the first time the initial performance in the task of our setup. Then we do one of these two perturbations, which I described before, so either a within manifold perturbation or an outside manifold perturbation, leading to like forcing the network either to do one of these two adaptations of the neural activity. Then we measure again what the task looks like. And then the crucial part is here, where we retrain the network in order to work with this perturbed mapping. And here we then really test how well it can train or learn new trajectories either within or outside.
So for the retraining, you initialize the matrix from scratch, or you take whatever you had?
I think we took whatever we had, but it didn't really matter because our recursively square, it pushes you anyway easily somewhere else.
Can I ask another? If the perturbation you're doing on the BCI mapping, did you first do some dimensionality reduction, compute the underlying subspace, and then administer? We do this in the BCI mapping. So this includes measuring the activity here, calculating the projection, and then So it's some kind of an on manifold. You align it to the direction of the subspace. Exactly. We align the decoder first to the internal manifold, and then we decode the 2D. From this. Okay, so let me start with the results. So we started with asking the question if there is a fundamental difference. Okay, yeah.
I got curious, like why BCI mapping and network training are separate, because it seems like to be able to compute the vector of the network, you need to have a mapping from network activity.
Yeah, it's actually true. I didn't want to talk about this, but it's of course actually true. The problem is that you also can't tune your BCI mapping if your network is not initially trained, because initially the network is not producing reliable dynamics. So we have to train it first, and the way we do it is we use a random decoder. Just simulating in a way, like the monkey also, it uses its motor cortex for doing movements, and he knows how to do this. So we want to start from a state where our network can actually do things, and then we want to.
Think about it that you kind of use a full rank decoder or like not low dimension but high dimension
Yeah, we thought about maybe we can take this offline because it's a crucial part, but it's not really affecting the results I will show. But yeah. So we started to ask the question if there's a fundamental difference. If you have an optimal observer, so if you have this perfect feedback here, would we observe a difference between within and outside manifold learning? And the answer is no, in our framework we actually don't. So what you see here is reconstructed trajectories basically. So we have 6 targets in our task. And the initial performance looks quite good. And then we can do the perturbation. And you see that both of these perturbations look approximately similar. And then if you look after retraining, you have nice straight reaches again. Now we quantify this by calculating the mean square error between, again, the target cursor velocities and the produced cursor velocities. And I will show these plots over and over again, so just get used to them. Like if we really want to see if the retraining performance is equal between here, outside and within. And just that you don't get lost, like I will put this several times up, this WMP, OMP, that you will notice. So now we know that there's no fundamental difference in terms of the retraining performance. But maybe one is using much more resources than the other. And what do I mean with resources? For example, the argument like from Arvin's talk with the weight changes. Like maybe for outside manifold, you need a lot more weight changes. And that's what maybe makes it in the real network harder. So if we in our setup look at this, we actually see that the weight changes are comparable between within and outside manifold learning. So what we plot here is the initial weight and the weight after adaptation. And you see that there is not much difference here. I mean, we have a totally different setup. So it's not so surprising that we maybe get a different result here. If we look at the outside manifold perturbation, how this is actually doing, like gaining task performance again during the retraining, it's quite interesting because we compute here the overlap between manifolds. So for the red and the blue here, we calculate the overlap between the manifold before retraining and the manifold after relearning. So we can compute do a PCA again after the network had changed its recurrent connections and then see how both overlap. For the within manifold perturbation, we observe like high overlap, which is expected because that's how the perturbation is. But interestingly, we find that for the outside manifold perturbation, it's not necessary that the network completely aligns with this perturbed manifold. And that's the case, like at least in our simulations, and I don't know about the experiment, but not like the latent space is 10-dimensional. And we chose this also to be 10-dimensional just to be in line with the experiment. Yes. So, but not all of these 10 dimensions are equally important for doing the task. And you can imagine that if you want to minimize the task error, then you maybe focus on these latent modes, which are most important in terms of the decoding rates or whatever. So what we actually find here that only a subset of the mode is really aligned, but then it's really aligned, but not all needs to be aligned.
Your manifold is flat. These are
it's linear.
components.
It's
linear.
PCA. Yeah.
And I think you said earlier about the decoder having access to all of the neurons. Like, so these results in the previous slide change much on the basis?
No, like we do the PCA taking into account all neurons, and then we have 10 dimensions, and then.
Right, but so if you did not have access to the whole network, it would not change this result or the previous slide, really?
This is not the main result I will come to, but like the main result is kind of that within manifold learning and outside manifold learning is equally well. I mean, it will definitely shift this up and down here. I guess so. But like the main part, to the take-home message is like with this ideal setup, you really, with this algorithm, you can train both. So that's basically what I said. So now, of course, the experiment did show a difference. So we thought, okay, what can we do now from this setup to find really which ingredients lead to a difference in within and outside manifold learning. So what we first checked was putting biological constraints in. And what we thought of was a local learning rule and dividing the network into E and I populations, so following Day's law. And we found that both of these didn't really change the fact that within is equally learnable as outside in our case. So
now this is not recursive.
Local, like the left one is not recursively square anymore because there you have this covariance. And this one here, it's based on this new paper from the Maas group. It's basically a kind of delta rule. So you only have error times eligibility or like, yeah, trace of the presynaptic. So it's local. Mm-hmm. So both of these facts didn't make a difference if we looked at within versus outside. So what we looked next was, okay, this error feedback signal here, so far we just set it to be the pseudo-inverse of the BCI mapping. But like the monkey doesn't know this from like initially. So what we tested now was how robust is the recurrent retraining with respect to errors in this feedback signal. And what we did first was, like if you remember, like this arrow here basically represents a matrix. And what we do now is we draw a random variable for each of the entries of this matrix. And this basically distorts now the feedback directions, basically. And if we increase the noise amplitude, so to say, we see that the retraining performance decreases, where in the end you basically can't retrain. But interestingly, there's an intermediate regime where we see that within manifold learning achieves better retraining with the same amount of misalignment in terms of the feedback. And we have like an intuition why this is the case. Namely, if you look back at what the retraining needs to achieve in terms of shifting the manifold. Like we saw before that you only, yeah, like let me put it like this. We think that this is the case because it's harder if you're searching for a new alignment in this high dimensional space. It's harder if you get the same error than if you're just within the manifold. Then you can tolerate a higher distortion because you don't need to find this new alignment in this space. But also note that here, in any case, if we make this noise factor high, your manifold of the network will go totally somewhere else. This means that if your feedback directions really define your manifold. So it really, depending on where your feedback is pointing, your internal dynamics realign to some manifold, whatever. And if it's just random, like in the case of high noise, you see that also for the within, you're totally driven off this initial manifold. And you see, again, if you plot the performance measured as mean squared error against this overlap, that there seems to be this task performance relevance threshold, which you need to have in order to have good task performance. So here I showed you that within manifold learning is more robust to a noisy error signal. What we also looked at is what happens if we have a sparse feedback signal. So what happens now is that not all neurons in our recurrent network gets a feedback signal. And therefore not all neurons, like the way how it works, the recursively square is that the neuron gets an error signal kind of, and then the incoming weights to this neuron are adapted. So if the neuron doesn't get an error signal, so it's 0, This means that there's no weight change in the incoming weights to this neuron. Yeah?
Was the overlap issue on the previous slide, is that like a function of the saturation of the neurons or something like that? Like, because you could imagine that, you know, with any degree of overlap that's non-zero, if you have, you know, dynamics that can be sort of sufficiently large, then you can project onto whatever dimension you care about, right? So
it's true, but in the blue case, outside manifold, it's really orthogonal. So you would never be able to do this in this case. But you're right, like it also depends. You can kind of find these two different strategies that first, like you have alignment, but you also can stay inside the original manifold and just change there. But yeah, we are not really talking about this or differentiating this here.
okay, and so do you have a strong intuition about what sets, you know, this? Like it was just an interesting to have this cut off in manifold overlap so stark.
If you think that there has to be some backpropagation of errors within the R and N, if the backpropagation paths, whatever they are, don't reach some neurons, so those neurons will not receive error information. Will receive zero error. It not be graded, but it will be just I do not receive error information. You know.
Oh wait, we're not doing backdrop though, right?
How do you train a recurrent network?
No, we're not doing backdrop. We're doing recursively square, where you don't need a backdrop in this sense. You do it every time step.
Well, but I understand how you're
in
doing
the
a medical
optim-
experiment, but
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it's trying to mimic when you're saying I send error directly to these neurons, but in a real network, not all neurons are connected to whatever is the sensory input, right?
Yeah, but they're plot of the ability of the network to do the task as a function of the overlap.
Okay.
Anyway.
No, it's specific. It's also specific, for example, if you look now at this, another imperfect feedback, it looks different. It's not that that I would say, oh, I expect exactly this relationship in the experiment. It's really dependent on, but maybe we can take this offline. So here again, we found that the within manifold retraining is more robust. And if we compare this now, just as a side note, here we kind of made reduced the number of plastic synapses, because these ones, for the neurons where there is no error signal, they are not plastic anymore. Now we can also think of another scenario where we reduce the number of plastic synapses, but in this case, each neuron gets an error signal, so each neuron participates, but then maybe each neuron receives about 10 incoming connections, and we make half of them plastic and half of them non-plastic. And interestingly, we found that this scenario, it's much better, because it can tolerate, if we have the same portion of plastic weights, it can tolerate this, so the retraining performance is quite good in comparison to this case where not all neurons participate. It's not really possible to do the retraining. Yeah, and this is again, but maybe I just switch it. So now we looked at this imperfect feedback, and we saw that within manifold is more robust to noisy as well as sparse error signals. But the really important thing now for us was to check if it would be at least in any way possible to infer these weights here, the feedback weights, because that's in the end what the monkey has to do. It doesn't get this BCI mapping from somewhere, it has to learn it in a way. And that was really cool, because we started with this simple idea of just doing a regression. So we're observing, we have this given BCI mapping here, and then we basically observe the neuroactivity and the output produced by this given BCI mapping. And then we try to infer, predict with a regression, the network activity from the cursor trajectory. And the regression weights here would then basically give us this inverse model. Because if this would be perfectly possible, then we would maybe expect to get the inverse of this output transformation. And what we find here is that if we do this for both of the perturbations, within and outside, that this is really possible, actually, for the within manifold perturbation. Like, if you do the simple regression, your inferred feedback rates are at least correlated to really the correct feedback rates. And this is not at all possible for the outside manifold perturbation. And just to check that we don't need like a massive amount of trials for this, already for, like in our case here, I don't know, 8, 9 trials, you get this, like you can learn this. So this was really puzzling, but also a very interesting result because it's really in line also in what the experiment's telling. And just to check this, we now inserted these inferred feedback rates into the recurrent retraining. So we did first the inference of the feedback rate and then used this inferred rates to train like the recurrent connection. And if we do this, we find indeed that the within manifold retraining works. It works not as well with the perfect feedback, which is expected, I think. But there's a huge difference really to the outside manifold retraining, which doesn't work at all. And if we look at, like we really see that the accuracy of this feedback learning, which we measure as correlation coefficient between the correct and the inferred feedback rates, it seems to be really relevant for this retraining. Although like for this, here for the within manifold, we have 20 networks. So we have 20 different networks, and it seems to be really, really variable. But we will look into this.
So would you say that what you have learned here is a forward model in some sense?
Inverse, right?
No,
but I'm always confused with the terminology.
You're saying that if I am the network and I can observe my own neural activity, I can predict what error I'm going to make.
It's the other way around.
The other way around, and it's the inverse.
Because I want the other way around to get the feedback from the observed error.
You want to predict the network activity from the cursor trajectory. So you're learning an inverse model.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So when we looked at why we have this huge variance here, we found again that this overlap between the manifold defined by the BCI readout and the internal manifold seems to be really relevant. And now we look at this, what I call condensed neural manifold. And what does this mean? Like in our setup, I said before, the latent space is 10-dimensional. And this is fixed for all experiments and like all networks here. It's the same as in the experiment. They also fixed this number. But also already in the experiment, they mentioned that it varies. Like if you calculate the dimensionality for each single session, this varies. So in fact, you not always have this full 10-dimensional manifold, but instead maybe you have a lower or higher relevant. I mean, it's anyway kind of arbitrary where you do the cutoff. But what this leads to is that for our within manifold perturbations, some of them are actually slightly outside manifold, because then if the internal manifold is lower dimensional than 10, then if you shuffle the decoding weights in some cases, you would need to go slightly outside. And this is basically, like if we calculate this overlap, then there's kind of a relationship to the feedback learning accuracy. And what we did here was for the outside manifold an interpolation. So if we interpolate between the completely orthogonal perturbation to the initial BCI mapping, we get like a nice relationship here. So now we wanted to see also, okay, we know now that the outside manifold retraining doesn't work at all if we have to learn the feedback rates. But what is happening there? Like, is it just doing something completely off, or So for this, we used again looking at manifold overlap, because it was there interesting to see that it's not that the inferred feedback rates for outside manifold perturbation are just noise, because then we would expect that our manifold after retraining is just something completely different than before. Instead, what we find is that the inferred feedback rates for the outside manifold perturbation are in fact pointing to directions inside of the manifold, which was kind of, curious to see, but this is basically what we see because it has this high overlap even after retraining. And we wanted to understand really why this works. And I think that's really the really important point here. So let me just, I will totally run out of time, but I don't know. Do you want? I don't know. Yes. Okay, so to really understand this better, we looked at a simplified setup. And here, the goal is basically to infer, by observing one latent variable, the eigenvector, like the projection of this variable. And so here in this case, we observe one neural mode, and we want to predict from this the high-dimensional neural activity. And the feedback weights, like the regression weights in this case, would be in the perfect case really the eigenvector, so really the projection of this mode. And yeah, can we do this? Because I mean, here very high dimension, and we really only observe this one mode. So for this, we used synthetic data where we could manipulate the eigenvalue spectrum directly. So we parameterized this, and then we constructed the covariance matrix, and then we drew like random variables from this covariance matrix, and this we used for our analysis. So this is the result of this analysis, and just let me walk you through this quickly, slowly. So on the diagonal of this plot, you see you basically see what we measured before, like the correlation coefficient between the true eigenvector and the observed one. And here, blue means that there's really a high correlation. And if you, for example, pick this first out here, so for the first neural mode, you can perfectly infer the eigenvector of this mode. And you see that this, this ability drops with increasing, with decreasing eigenvalue, basically, because like the eigenvalues here are ordered. But then the interesting part is that if you are here, so you want to infer a mode or the eigenvectors of a mode which is actually not really present in your system. It's just because you anyway have this high, you have the decomposition to the eigenvalues, and yeah, anyway. And what happens then if we compare then the inferred weights not with the true eigenvector, but also with all the other eigenvectors for all the other modes, we actually see that in this case here, if the eigenvalue is low, the feedback weights correspond to a superposition of the prominent modes of the system. And if you think about this, it kind of explains why, maybe not intuitively, why we observe this for the outside manifold perturbation, that it's actually, if you infer the feedback weights, they're pointing in within manifold. Because if we go back to the definition what an outside manifold perturbation is, by scrambling the weights, you basically create a new random eigenvector system. And this, like your new eigenvector for this perturbation can then be described by a superposition of all the eigenvectors you had previously. And now, if we compare this to this picture, like and you want to infer this because this is actually what you want to have. But now, like for the first modes, for the prominent modes of the system, you can do this inference. But then if you go to modes which are not actually present, what you infer is not actually the eigenvector you need here, but a superposition of the prominent modes. So then, in the end, you anyway end up with inferred feedback direction, which point inside the space of the prominent modes, which is quite interesting. Yeah, it took a bit of time till we got this. So.
Barbara, shouldn't you be able to see these changes as you follow the outside manifold perturbations? Because you are having continuous learning, right? Unlike what we did.
Yeah.
So you should be able to see how these manifolds are rotating as you are training the network.
Yeah, you mean.
Like this exact thing that you just said.
But I don't really get how it's because here it's before we train the network, right? Here we do this offline in a way. like for now we do the feedback learning offline. But you're right, it's another question how it works online, because it interacts. Yeah, but we...
But this was online.
No, it's offline, yeah, important point. So, yeah, I think I will wrap up here maybe and skip the last part. So, here in this last step, I think it's really the most important of the work is that we found that these feedback weights, which are necessary for driving learning, are kind of having this preference of learning within manifold. And yeah, I will skip the last part where we checked if outside manifold learning might be still possible, and just summarize. So what we started out with was this experimental finding that within manifold learning is possible, and it's very fast in a way, so possible within a session, but outside manifold learning, it's very, very hard. And we asked the question, what neuromechanism might underlie this, and especially to which extent can recurrent weight changes explain or account for this experimental observation. And then first I showed you that the RNN trained with perfect feedback makes no difference between within and outside manifold learning. And then I showed you that the biological constraints like local learning rule or a separation in E and I doesn't also make a difference here in our context. But then where we started to see a difference was if we looked at the feedback signal. And we showed that within manifold learning is more robust to a noisy or sparse feedback signal. And also this side point that it's better to have like random plastic weights in comparison to have some neurons where the incoming weights are all plastic and some where none are plastic. And then this important point I tried to explain you and give you some intuition about the result that we really can only learn the feedback weights for within manifold perturbations, but not for outside manifold perturbations. And yeah, this part I skipped, so we also try to go into this, how outside manifold learning could still be possible with an incremental strategy, which was also used in this experiment. So just a few thoughts then at the end. Of course, we are not saying here that this is the case how it works. It's more like testing to which extent it might be possible, but because it's in the community, I think a bit discarded that local weight changes might underlie several observations because it's just not testable also. So a lot of people think that it's really the input drive to motor cortex which explains this learning. And I totally agree that this is, I think, very important, but it might also show, like our work shows, that it's not completely off. Like you shouldn't discard it too early, I think. Then also coming back to Sarah Sollers and Lee Miller's results on the stable manifold, our work now predicts kind of, or postdicts that if you have the same decoder, so the same actuator, the same arm, this gives you the same feedback weights, right? So it's the same, it's a stable decoder, so it will always point in the same directions, therefore would always lead to a stable manifold. It would point out if you don't change the plant. Yeah, the plant, exactly. So that's kind of interesting that it also fits in this picture here. And one actually could test this by, I guess, like changing, or in the BCI mapping, really gradually changing the output or something like this. Yeah, and in the last part, it's not really important. So thanks, and I will stay here. Yeah, thanks. Sorry for taking too long.
No, it's perfect. You even have time.
So if you want, I can come back now to questions.
Really dumb question. So your network. So specifying. So obviously your output is a two-dimensional vector of the kinematic of the cursor moving towards the trajectory, right? Is there any sense of time in this output? I couldn't quite work out, is it just, you're just specifying a vector each time and you're just assuming that vector is in a given direction?
The target is constant.
Yeah, so you're not evolving you're not evolving the trajectory of the cursor
online
itself.
correction.
It's just literally that vector. Because one of the key things in the Sattler results is that the acquisition time never comes down again. Even for the within manifold perturbation, the acquisition time stays really high.
The what?
The acquisition time, the time to get the cursor to the target, always stays really high. It never comes down to the pre-trained level.
Sure.
Yeah. Looked again this morning. So, which is one of the key bits of evidence that.
Yeah, there's a plateau. I
Yes,
mean,
it comes down a little bit, but
yeah,
it's way above the well-trained form.
that's true.
Which is one of the key bits of evidence that it's something else correcting that decodec, because there's another imposed stage then. So my question was going to be, have you had any thought about where that lag is coming from, if it's a plasticity change?
I mean, I think we are totally missing out on online correction method, which are totally the case in motor cortex. But I think it's very hard to include it in a way, because you have a lot of options what you do. We also thought about doing like a feedback loop, really, with like feeding the error actually back as a signal and going in this direction, but then we decided just to go with the stream, finish it, and then maybe start again. But yeah, sorry, I can't really make
Yeah, I was just curious if you had any thoughts, yes, because you're obviously closer to this than me, yeah.
Maybe if I have something, I will come back to you.
Cool.
Absolutely.
You're gonna make me ask my question? Okay, well, so I was a bit confused about the learning. So I don't totally understand what you were saying about the learning the small eigenvalues.
Yeah.
And it seemed like maybe what you were saying was that when you learn the large eigenvalues, I mean, my intuition says when you learn the large eigenvalues, you have some noise, and that noise is full rank, and you project it onto the low eigenvalues, and all of a sudden your small eigenvalues you learn as a decomposition of your first ones, right?
Yeah, but the large, I think of it that I mean, you mean the large eigenvalues actually the low ones, right? The not prominent ones.
Yeah, so I'm saying the important, you learn the important eigenvectors in the space, and then, the things that you have trouble learning, is it the case that you have trouble learning them because noise in the ones that you learn well is full rank? Or is that I just completely do not understand why.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand
Sorry.
because it's still, like for us it took very long, and I still don't know why this is the case, but the idea is that you have your prominent modes in your system. And then what the PCA gives you, it gives you, if you have 800 neurons, you get 800 modes. You get, right. But to some extent, then the modes which are not present in the system, it's just, you don't observe them, right? It's just an arbitrary construct because you have this 800 eigenmodes which you get, but if you observe them, they are not really meaningful in any sense, right? Yeah.
I guess what you're trying to say is, imagine that you have two relevant eigenvalues, right? So you have a flat cigar, and all the points are kind of living in that flat cigar, and almost no fluctuations outside of that two-dimensional plane, right? So now I'm going to take any of the eigenvectors, number 1, number 2, or any of the other, 78 ones, if you were recording 80 neurons. And I ask you to project all the data in the direction of that eigenvector. And I ask you, can you, from that projection, reconstruct the original data? So clearly, your best choice is to take psi1 to project into the leading eigenvector. The second best choice is to project on psi2, which is the second leading eigenvector. And if you project onto psi79, and I ask you to try from that to reconstruct the original distribution, you're going to do a very poor job. Isn't that essentially, I mean, before you start asking about whether these eigenvectors are part of the feedback weights or not, there is a basic property of PCA, which is that if what is going to be the reconstruction error if I'm only allowed to project onto a given eigenvector? And the reconstruction error is going to be minimal when you project on the leading eigenvector, and it's going to be monotonically worse as you project into less and less
But if
important
I-
eigenvectors.
Why, if you have high rank noise and you're trying to learn the feedback weights,
Well, so now the question is to connect this picture about PCA to the feedback weights. That's
Yeah.
the,
Okay,
that's the,
so just
okay.
one important point which maybe I missed. The important point is if you compare like the regression accuracy for outside or within manifold learning in terms of the feedback weights, the accuracy is the same. It's just that your weights you infer are not unique. Like it's not that you can worse predict the new activity from this outside manifold perturbation. It's more that the weights you get are more degenerate in a sense. That's how I think about it, because you are at this part of the spectrum where your eigenvectors are basically just random, except that they are orthogonal to the important ones.
Because you have a BCI and you're trying to learn the inverse model of that. And from the point of view of the BCI, the other n-2 eigenvalues are essentially zero. From the point of view of the BCI
But the BCI is changed, right?
Yes, but it's still two-dimensional, right? So you only care, the only thing that disorients you is the projections into the null subspace. But from the point of view of the BCI, the null space is highly degenerate. Any linear combination within the null subspace is in the null subspace.
Yeah,
in the original BCI.
But if you change the system and...
So whether I make a perturbation here or here or here or here, as long as I am in the null subspace, they are all equivalent perturbations.
But still, if you're projecting here or here or here, your output will be different, right?
Of course.
And this is what you use.
But that's what you need to correct for. But this ambiguity, this degeneracy that you said you cannot identify the correct eigenvector.
Yeah, I think we're speaking about, I think I have the same intuition. It's just very hard to...
Yeah. You have to think a lot about high-dimensional spaces.
At least if you use linear algebra.
Yeah.
And you can still use linear algebra.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.